Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So we are back again with our ranking series. It's December, it's the time of the year. I do these twice a year. I do them in the middle, around June, July time, and then just before the year end in December. And so far we have ranked all of the 2022 buffs. We have ranked all of the 2022 new champions released, starting from the least successful ones to the ones that have absolutely blown us away. And now we need to do the class ranking situation. Obviously, every single class has their own specialties, has their own purposes. Every single class has uses, and ultimately all of them are amazing. And also, long are gone the days where we have any given class at all whatsoever that is, significantly behind others. Every class has plenty of amazing champions that we all use and love, and this game is just growing and expanding, and that is like one of the more important things that also has like full-fledged happened within the last half a year is the addition of battlegrounds, and that definitely also has affected the class relationships overall. But most importantly, typically these class rankings also change based on the new champions released, based on the meta trends. When we have more champions surging, some champions are declining. And ultimately, again, the intention of these videos is not to insult your family's honor or completely shake your value and belief system. It is to discuss the champions in the game that we all like to play that much. We all care about slightly different things in this game. We have different personalized experiences. We run different mastery setups, focus on different game modes, have our own personal preferences. And all of that obviously affects how we rank these champions. In my personal ranking videos, I typically try to take in consideration mainly the meta trends of the game, the trends in the most competitive of the game modes, because I personally believe that you can do large segments of this game even with the worst champions. You can pick up a Drax and do, a significant percentage of the content with the Drax. You're going to have a harder time, you're going to take longer, but you can. At the same time, I do think that champions find their value and prove their value when the most competitive players use them reliably and most frequently. I do think that a champion, if it starts shining in Alliance War, definitely has proved his value. I think if a champion is used at the top tiers of Battlegrounds frequently, that has proven the champion's value, so on and so forth. Not as much with story content per se, because I do think that especially now with Act 7 and Act 8, a plethora of champions can do story content, and with all of those damage increase nodes, we can see it's like, oh my god, look at that, we're hitting, 100,000 heavy attacks or something. At the same time, I do think that it also matters how frequently champions answer problem fights, challenge modes, stuff like Grandmaster's Gauntlet, stuff like Eternity of Pain. And ultimately, that is how I try to arrive at my valuations. Here we can see the old ranking that I did in June. We started from Mutant, being as the best class, and then went to Cosmic, to Science, to Tech, to Skill, to Mystic. And there have been quite a few changes since that. And again, no matter in what order I will organize these, I'm sure that there will be people who will disagree, and that is perfect. That is exactly how it is meant to be. I am not trying to build up a cult. I don't need any one of you to listen, every single word that's coming out of my mouth and, accept it as some sort of ultimate truth. It's not. I don't work for Kabam. I don't have statistics of which class gets most ranked and stuff like that, or which class champions get most used, so on and so forth. Therefore, there will obviously be a part of subjectivity to this. So let's start. Let's start with the class that unfortunately I will leave at the very bottom of this ranking list, and it is going to be Tech class. I feel that Tech class is kind of starting to fall back into their box, and many, if not most, of the new Tech champions, and especially their primary uses, I think recently, have largely shrunk in a sense that, yeah, most of the Tech champions are great at destroying majority of the Mutant champions, of course, even though obviously we still have Magneto running around, kind of like flipping that Uno card back at the tech class champions. But we do have Nimrod, we have Omega Sentinel, we have Warlock, and we have a whole bunch of other champions that are excellent at destroying mutants. But then when it comes to their capabilities in the other aspects, I feel that tech class champions are well balanced. I think that there are many champions that are extremely capable at a task or two, and they are perfectly usable, perfectly rankable, perfectly serviceable. But I also feel that tech class number 1 does have quite a few duds, so it is quite top heavy class in my opinion. And then second of all, again, I do feel that tech is being pushed further and further into more and more narrow kind of little box, where even the best of the tech champions, if we're not using them against mutants, often do seem good, do seem great, but they're not blowing us away. Like if you're using tech champion in random casual content, for instance, the best tech champion that has come out in 2022 would be like Omega Sentinel and let's say Iron Man Infinity War. Neither one of those two champions are kind of like blowing us away like Hulkling and Galen does, or Hercules and CGR, or a handful of other champions. They're great, they're well balanced, they have plenty of utility and access to different kind of bits, but it seems that they are somewhat understated when it comes to comparing them with the competition, and that is the most important thing. Because I am by no means trying to say that any of these classes are bad or these champions are bad. But what we do need to remember is that they do exist in infinite competition within themselves. Because they are fighting for our attention. They are fighting for our resources and catalysts. And they're fighting for our time, for us to learn those champions. And I feel that many of the tech champions have plenty of capability, but they're just not being overly successful when it comes to gripping the player base as much as some of the champions higher up on this list. Obviously, we do have still the stable champions. I, however, do think that Ghost's status is the best champion in the game that's available at 6-star, because Quake is ultimately the best champion in the game. Still, there's a reason why Kabam's afraid to release her as 6-star, but let's say that Ghost in Quake's absence was easily crowned as the best champion in the game. I don't think that's necessarily the case anymore. I do think that Ghost is incredibly powerful, still extremely capable, but I do think that there are plenty of other factors that are catching up to Ghost and other champions that are also catching up in their usability and capabilities. So ultimately, unfortunately, I do think that tech class did not necessarily receive quite as much as others. I think the only class that got worse additions overall this year was Mutant. And part of that, and part of the way current metagame is shaping up, I do think that tech, unfortunately, at the moment, is towards the bottom of the ranking list here. Well, at the bottom of the ranking list. I, however, personally, obviously, still do love tech class. There are tons of champions, again, as I said, that I do like, love, and use, and every class has champions like that. But somebody has to win, somebody has to lose in these rankings, basically, and then tech class, at the moment, is going to the very bottom. Moving up, I actually struggled with this class a lot. And I'm going to put skill classes 5th at the moment, because it feels like they should be higher, because there are so many great skill champions. And skill champions largely have been given a great opportunity to shine also in Battlegrounds. But I'm going to explain why I placed skill as 5th. I also do think that you could easily place them, like, let's say, a spot higher, but I'm going to explain why I didn't. And the first reason is because, again, with these ranking videos, we do need to consider the impact of the new champions. And when we look at the champions released, skill class actually got quite a few new champions. We have Misty Knight, Valkyrie, Black Cat, Mantis, and Attuma. Now, in case of Mantis and Attuma, their impact is unknown because they're brand new. So I pretty much have to take those two champions out of the valuation here, and I need to look at Misty Knight, Black Cat, and Valkyrie. And all of whom are very capable champions, without a doubt. But at the same time, I do feel that skill class hasn't managed to extend too much from where they were, and let me kind of try and explain what I mean by it. Like, we have Valkyrie at the moment, that's, I have no doubt, is going to be doing great things in the contest. But Valkyrie largely serves very similar function as Massacre at the very moment, and shares a very similar playstyle. And then, for instance, we also got the addition of Black Cat, right? And everything that Black Cat does, we already have, let's say, Falcon, who has the immediate ability accuracy reduction, and skill class is sticking very strong to their base principles at the moment, if we're not looking at Mantis and Attuma yet. And that is why I think where it is going to be extremely important to point that out. Do you think skill class does exactly the same things that they have always done? They haven't moved kind of like left or right, and that's why they also haven't necessarily moved in their rankings. I do think that in my next list, I will end up ranking up skill class higher, because it is quite clear that skill class is having, let's say, above average impact on Battlegrounds metas. It is clear that there are many capable champions coming up, and there are more and more champions that are being, valued higher because of either addition of new nodes or new game modes, as in the case of Battlegrounds. And that is why skill class is remaining here, because I do think it's amazing class. Kingpin is one of my favorite champions in the entire game, and I do think that Kingpin is arguably the best Battlegrounds champion, period, for instance. I love this class. But, again, when we're talking about expanding in the daily usage, expanding in, the usability of the classes, I do think skill class is doing just fine, but I just think other classes did kind of more to elevate themselves and to cover their own weaknesses. And with the new champion releases or, new surges of champion popularity, I do think that all of the 4 classes above, maybe with the exception of one, which is Mutant, but Mutant's a bit different case, other classes have just advanced more, I think. And yet again, as soon as we see exactly what Mantis is capable of, as soon as we have a proper gauge of Attuma, and then Black Cat, I'm sure is going to continue to be increasingly more popular, I am fully open to moving this class up higher in the next ranking. But for now, just because I'm kind of like erring on the side of caution, and I do not want to try and oversell the importance of Mantis and Attuma in skill class, because I do think it could be potentially quite big, but that's just that speculation here at this point. And the class that did move from the very bottom up by 2 spots is going to be Mystic class. And my constant grievance about Mystic class has always been that they are great champions for relatively specific situations. And in vast majority of the cases, pretty much nobody picks up a Mystic champion as, their daily questing driver. As in, like, even Dr. Doom, who we widely acknowledge as the best Mystic champion, because he's just ridiculous in terms of tankiness and utility and, how well he controls the fights. Even he's not necessarily a champion that you will want to use immediately as you enter the quest. No, he's the champion that you will read the nodes. You're going to see that you need some power control or buff control, or you need, some specific playstyle, and then you're going to go to Dr. Doom. Mystic class pretty much never had the Hercules or Ghost or CGR or Omega Red or anything like that. They were always like very specialized tools, typically requiring opponents to have access to buffs in order to fully power them. That also was always a major aspect of their designs, where all of the newer Mystic champions especially were always designed with Mystic dispersion in mind, because having access to Mystic Dispersion as a mastery has always been a bit of a blessing and a curse to Mystic champions in general. I do think that, obviously Mystic Dispersion and MD5 does make many Mystic champions, much more powerful, and in right situations, absolutely ridiculous. At the same time, when we're looking at those champion abilities individually, if Mystic Dispersion didn't exist, I can guarantee you that many of these champions would be designed differently and would be better for everyday situations, because Kabam devs would not have to worry about, what happens when you bring in this champion in a match where opponent has 10 buffs and you basically start gaining infinite power. So that always has also, in my opinion, served as a bit of a stranglehold on the Mystic class. Mystic class never really had your generic brawlers, your generic kind of utility champions. You always were, confined into the matchups where you need either very specific power control, or you needed opponent to have buffs, or then maybe access to, some very specific utility bits. But that has changed now. And that is why I think Mystic has moved from the bottom higher up. Because not only Mystic class now has Tigra, which was, the initial trailblazer of just a ridiculous speed Mystic questing champion, if you are good enough with her, because there was always that caveat. Tigra is not and will never be, a champion that vast majority of the player base will just casually pick up and use in matchups. You do need quite a bit of practice, you do need quite a bit of skill, you do need quite a bit of experience and know-how, and facts of life are that an average player will not get the same results out of Tigra that, Fintech will or somebody else. But now we have more options besides Tigra for that. And namely here, I'm obviously looking at the surge of Juggernaut as, one of the most OP Battlegrounds nukes. But also, for instance, on a personal note, I have been using Juggernaut as one of my main questing champions for like several weeks now, ever since I ranked him up. And he does just as good of a job, if not better, in many instances, than, Hercules would, because you don't need to worry about ramping him up in a casual quest, or as a CGR would, because he also gets to his level 2 very quickly because he has increased combat power rate. If you happen to nullify buff along the way, perfect, you get that Mystic Dispersion, and the fact that you're unstoppable means that you just can be extremely carefree. So now we have Tigra, we have Juggernaut, and on top of it we have Scarlet Witch released as a 6-star with that Quicksilver synergy. And we still have Diablo, who can be very easily used, in non-buff situations. And Mystic class is changing. Also, if we look at the new additions of Mystic class in 2022, we do have Rintra, which has, basically skyrocketed toward the top of people's tier lists and desire lists and, rank up priority lists. And he's getting a ton of use virtually everywhere. We do have Spidey Supreme, which again, it's quite hard to judge his full impact yet because he's not widely available, but Wiccan is just about coming in his own. So I do think in between Rintra, in between Wiccan, in between Juggernaut's buff and him gaining mass amounts of popularity, in between Mordor's buff and him being more visible in the most competitive aspect of the game mode, and also, which is not irrelevant, because of the game mode of Battlegrounds themselves. Because in most of the metas, for many of the people, Mystic is typically the most populated class in their decks, or often one of the most populated classes in their decks, unless they are running Recall. And that is because of the Mystic tank defenders, because we do have the Sasquatch, we do have Rintra now, we do have Mojo, Man-Thing, Mephisto. So still in Battlegrounds game mode, because we do need to overall take that in consideration as well, Mystic class is one of the most capable classes overall, one of the classes where people definitely do need to invest heavily if they want to bolster their defenses. And then also, obviously, we do have Mystic nuke options for buff-heavy matchups, like Longshot or Hood can be extremely potent and quick. So yeah, I do think that in between being extremely relevant in Battlegrounds, both defensively and offensively. And that's also like one of the bigger things is where Mystic class is the class that pretty much completely shuts down Cosmic Champions. Like techs often shut down mutants, or in most cases. But Mystic class also has gained that user friendliness. They do have their own brawlers now that do not care whether opponents have buffs or not. You put on that Quicksilver synergy on Scarlet Witch and you can just blitz through quest with her. Get good enough with Tigra, and you don't care if opponents get buffs or not because you're still going to rapture them to no end. Bring in Juggernaut and just smash that unstoppable till they are, blue against the wall. So we do have all these things kind of like happening with Mystic class, so I do think that definitely their improvement here is warranted, and that is exactly the reason why I felt it was appropriate to place them above skill at the moment, which I still think is amazing class, and also about tech. Because Mystic class has just definitely expanded their usability and importance overall in this game, I think the most, aside from the top class in the game right now. So here we go. That's why Mystics are right here. Let's move on to the Mutants, as in spot number 3. And spot number 3 is Mutants. Mutants were long considered as the most powerful class in the game, and it is very powerful class, without a doubt. But Mutants do kind of struggle in certain areas at the moment. And there are like 3 or 4 different reasons why I didn't only take Mutants down from the top spot, I moved them down to 3rd. And let me explain those reasons right now. Number 1, 2022 has not been a great year of additions for them. Not really. I mean, yeah, of course, Toad and Sauron definitely has their uses. But, primarily they are, mainly champions with defensive capabilities in mind. And both of them suffer from the same thing that majority of the mutant champions suffer, is that Nimrod, Omega Sentinel, Warlock exists. And I think if previously we were talking about Mystic class that gets shut down hardest by the Science class just by the virtue that Human Torch exists, well, in my head, Tech class basically has like 4 Human Torches now. So even the greatest mutant defenders now, they just struggle so much more to be relevant. Because when you flip out the top techs against, the toughest mutants, defensively, it's not a matter of whether they will get those champions down. It's a matter of, whether those champions will survive a level 2 in these days. Alliance War defense mutants have suffered drastically, and Balgron's defense mutants have also suffered drastically. Now, that is not to say that I have no presence there at all on defense, but that is to say you will probably not draft your mutants early if you know for the fact that the opponent has more than 3 or 4 tech champions in their deck. And that's how it unfortunately often goes. Yeah, of course, we still run our Domino, because if you happen to place Domino whilst the opponent doesn't have one of those specific counters, then she can wreak havoc. Similarly, with Weapon X and a handful of other champions, but it's always at a point where, you just hope that there is not going to be an appropriate answer from the opponent. Otherwise, they're just going to melt completely. And it's not the same situation like majority of the Mystic champions, for instance, have with Science champions, where if opponent does have, Mr. Negative, that Sasquatch will still put on some sort of fight. These mutants will not. That's one thing. So the first 2 things, definitely that entire mutant class just get wrecked by the tech class, and that is basically seemingly has been the entire design purpose in designing tech champions, and obviously has a knock-on effects on mutants. Second was the new additions. They're just nowhere near as good as the other classes have gotten them recently. And the third one is the nature of the game. As I always say, the value of these champions do change based on the metas that we are playing, based on what kind of content is getting released, whether we're getting new Everest type content, whether we have more challenge mode content, so on and so forth. And also based on what kind of other new champions are coming into the game. And because of that, I do think that mutants have lost quite a bit of their shine. Like, we have arguably, or previously, considered APOC as the best mutant champion in the game and arguably top 5 champion in the game. And he just isn't anymore. He's still great for story content, for plenty of challenge content, of course. But he has taken a significant step back in Alliance War. He has definitely not, incorporated himself well in Battlegrounds in any meaningful tiers. And similar things just kind of seem to happen with plenty of other champions in the Mutant class. We do have, obviously, the success stories still of Archangel and Kitty Pryde, and Domino has gained a lot of ground. Omega Red has become more relevant despite the problems that Omega Red has been dealing with for quite considerable amount of time, and that is the fact that he's quite a typical mutant champion, and also the fact that the new kits of more and more champions being released also incorporate some ridiculous special animations, and it's often harder to keep your spores on against, some of the newer mechanics that are coming out for these champions. So ultimately, I think it's just, again, the biggest problem is the game trends, the meta trends, the demands of this game. And Battlegrounds hasn't been necessarily extremely kind to mutants. And again, this might be personal experience, but just as an anecdotal evidence to submit, I have, at the very least, 3 different metas struggled to find a mutant to put in my deck because I wanted and needed a couple more mutants in my deck because I knew that there are people at the highest tiers running Elsa Bloodstone, and I wanted to be able to, avoid Elsa trapping in Battlegrounds. And there have been quite few metas where I'm like, I don't want to add any of these mutants. I think one of them was most recently in Rich Get Richer one, where I just didn't want to run majority of these champions. Obviously, we have the staple ones like, Domino and Archangel and, perhaps Bishop. Bishop definitely has elevated himself in mutant class. But then past that point, I was like, I don't want to put these mutants in my deck, but I kind of have to in order to escape from Elsa. And I think that kind of spoke quite a bit of volume to me personally about the fact that mutant class definitely is not the most powerful class in the game anymore. Now, they do have a ton of utility and versatility, going on for them. I do think that mutant class is one of the better spread out in terms of their abilities, because for the initial 4 or 5 years in the game, I think that Kabam didn't necessarily know what they want mutants to be. So they kind of ended up with a bit of everything in terms of immunities, access to debuffs, special attack damage. But then again, we have plenty of mutants that just don't confine with that. We have like Omega Red, who functions completely differently. Obviously, we have Archangel, who is quite a unique beast, and then we have Magneto, so on and so forth. So I do think the mutant is very varied class. But at the same time, I think majority of their kind of like flagship champions are just not doing their best in the current metas. And placement that's going to be controversial, and let me make this 100% clear. I absolutely have never hidden my bias towards the science class. Science class has always been my favorite class in the game, or at the very least ever since I remember having a favorite class in the game. I think science class is amazing. If I would have to pick one class to do as much as I can do in the game, I would pick science class, because they might be relatively tied down in the method of their utility applications, which is largely often relying on debuffs and seldom being able to gain buffs. At the same time, I do think they cover the furthest amount of abilities, the most ground. I think that if there is something to be done in MCOC, there will probably be Science Champion who can get it done with, like, couple of exceptions. But if you need an immunity, I think you can find pretty much any immunity in science class. If you need evade counters, you can find that. Unstoppable counters, you can find that. Now you have even staggers, so you have buff control in science class. Then science class is pretty much the exclusive class of power stings and plenty of other abilities. They obviously have power control and petrify and ability accuracy reduction, and there's just so much this class can do, and that has been improving. And I do think that it's very important to note that not only we have arguably Quicksilver, who is, arguably the most jam-packed utility champion in the game at the moment, if we are talking about the sheer things this champion can do. He has access to like trauma, he has access to huge bursts of damage, bypass miss, bypass unstoppable, bypass evade, parry non-contact attacks. He has access to wither, therefore he can counter power gain effects, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Again, might not be the easiest execution necessarily, and that is also unfortunately one of the hallmarks of the science class, because science class champions are typically champions that require you to line things up well enough in most cases, and they will not have the biggest yellow numbers, which unfortunately means that a lot of people overlook a lot of science champions. At the same time, I don't think we can really argue with the additions in science class. Every single one of the science champions that has been added this year easily landed in like the top 10 list of the champions. So 40% of 2022 top 10 champions were science champions. So that is to say that, in my opinion, they got a huge boost in terms of their quality. And then obviously, looking at the general game trends, I do think that they are coming in their own. Science champions typically have this very weird, unique thing about them, where almost all of them are initially underestimated, and then within a month or 2 or 3, then people come around and realize how amazing they are. Like, that definitely happened with every single champion released in 2022. It took us a bit of time, but after that, we definitely realized that Mr. Negative is amazing, Anti-Venom is amazing, Spider-Man 2099 is amazing, Overseer is amazing, and that has also happened with majority of the 2020 champions, where we have, Spider-Ham, who definitely is still rocking towards the higher tiers. We have Immortal Abomination, and we have I-Hulk. Red Guardian, unfortunately, hasn't been doing so well, and that is the same thing is kind of happening with the science champions released this year, but this year I think we were kind of smarter and caught up to how amazing they are quicker, because we have Scorpion, who's just destroying alliance wars, destroying hard challenge content, he's destroying battlegrounds. We have Quicksilver, who definitely has tons of applications throughout. Titania is getting massive amounts of popularity, and Spot isn't even wildly available, but I would argue that at the moment he's most sought after champion by most of the endgame players. That isn't something to do with prestige. I think in the next 6-star feature, majority of the people are desperate to get Spot, just because they have seen what he can do in battlegrounds and some other situations. And I think that kind of characterizes science class quite well. Now, obviously, it is still a shame that we don't have a 6-star Quake. That would put science class even higher, I think. But ultimately, I do think that science at the moment is the second best class in the game. I also do think that majority of the mid-tier players will disagree with me, because I do think that majority of the mid-tier players ridiculously heavily underestimate science champions. And that primarily has to do with lack of big yellow numbers, or the fact that they are not always the easiest to use. And that is by no means meant to be as an insult to one's honor or family's legacy, but it's just a fact that quite a few of the science champions are based on, specific mechanics, rotations. They do deserve, some learning curve there, and they do demand some know-how from you. And with many of these champions, again, you're not going to get the big yellow numbers out, but you're going to get insane amounts of utility, and you're going to get the job done about as well as it can be done in this game. So I think science class deserves second spot at the moment. You can feel free to disagree, but I do feel quite strongly about that. And then the top class, and there is not much to say at the moment. I think that doesn't seem self-explanatory. I think at the moment Cosmic class is the most successful class in the game. I do think that majority of the fights happening right now in Marvel Contest of Champions are being done by Cosmic Champions. And I do mean it. I don't mean that Cosmic Champions are the most popular compared to other classes. I do think genuinely that when it comes to looking at Alliance Quest, daily questing, stuff like that, there are more people using Cosmic Champions daily today than potentially all of the other 5 classes combined. Because one of the coolest things about Cosmic Champions always has been is the raw damage and the speed and the ease of that damage. There is most of the time no super finicky rotations or setups. Majority of the Cosmic Champions are extremely straightforward, like Corvus, like CGR, like even Galen in a sense, and Hyperion and Hulkling and Hercules and so on and so forth. Just damage for days and extremely quick access. The problem Cosmic class often struggled with, and there was a time when Cosmic class was legitimately the worst class in the game, or one of the worst class in the game, and there are kind of remnants of that still in the game. If you look carefully, that you will definitely notice that there are quite a few Cosmic Champions that are still subpar or outdated. Cosmic class is one of the largest classes in the game, if not the largest class. I didn't check the counts right now, but there's quite a few duds as well. But with the recent additions to Cosmic class, in 2022 they have received Gore, who is getting a tune-up and is already gaining quite significant amount of popularity in recent month or so. Then we have Galen and Hulkling, who are, in my opinion, both best 2 additions in 2022 in MCOC. And then we can take a look at 2021. And out of those champions, we have Hercules, who is arguably the best champion in the game. We have Null, who is definitely extremely capable as well. Odin, again, another champion that's gaining more credit in recent months, especially with his ability to handle Eternity of Pain fights and Alliance War. Then we have Cersei, another champion that initially was underestimated and is definitely coming into his own. And obviously 2020 has been, CGR year basically for the Cosmic class. So I do think in the last about 2.5 years, Cosmic class has gone from strength to strength to strength. We have had, more successful additions in forms of buffs, like King Groot, for instance. Hyperion was released as a 6-star, and Silver Surfer seeing more usage largely because of Battlegrounds. And yeah, I think Cosmic class at the moment is the best class in the game. And what kind of describes them is basically tons of buffs and tons of damage. And most of the time, just enough utility to get them by. They're definitely not the most utility-packed champions. Like when it comes to, how many difficult matchups perhaps each individual top champion could take. I think Science class definitely, for instance, does more than Cosmic class does. But the reason Cosmic class is so popular is because they do enough, but they do it extremely fast, they do it extremely effective, and you want to use those champions, and that is ultimately, how this game works. You do want to have the most effective option, the fastest option available to you that does enough to cover these fights, and that's how Cosmic class largely works. And obviously I do think that Hulkling and Galen vastly improve in the utility department of an average Cosmic champion, let's say. So here we are. I do think that at the moment the best class in the game is Cosmic class. So what do these rankings mean? And again, I will here show you like a brief summary somewhere up there. We have Cosmic as a top class: Science, Mutant, Mystic, Skill, and Tech. I do think that in the middle it's quite muddled. I do think that Cosmic is quite undeniably the best class in the game. I do think that Tech class is weaker than other classes at the moment. I think that very good arguments can be made about swapping 2 with 5 around in some sort of order. I don't insist that this has to be followed as a Bible. And here we are. That means that this is also the order the class rankings will be done. So the next class ranking that I do is going to be Tech, then we're going to move to Skill, then we're going to move to Mystic, Mutant, Science, and Cosmic is going to be the last one. So those are also going to be the videos, if everything goes right, that I will be making for upcoming 6 or so days. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know which class do you think is the best class. How would you rate the other classes and all that other good stuff. If you do wish to support the channel, I would greatly appreciate it. These definitely do take quite a lot of brain power and pondering and discussion and research to make as well, in a sense, because I do want to be as well argumented as possible with these things. So hit that like button, hit all the good buttons, support the channel however you can. All of that is extremely appreciated. And I hope you guys are having a wonderful December. See you soon. Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So we have all the information about the next